Hello and welcome to Knights Talks. I'm joined by the Black Knight again, as always. I'm Joe from Brothers Crin, and we're joined now by a Norman American Knight, I guess, all the way from King Richard's court. And I know this is a slightly more showy and fantastical way of introducing Michael from Memory Medieval. Honestly, one of my favorite Substacks and probably my favorite Twitter account just for all the history stuff you do and the castles you share. Starfort Saturday is
beautiful castles.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm not gonna lie. When I see those castle posts, they make me think I need my driver's permit here. I need to finally get that paperwork sorted. I want to drive to all those castles. I want to see them all. I want to explore them all. So, like,
you have to while you're there.
Yeah. Well, I'm not just going to be staying here for 1 or 2 months. I'm staying here for life. So,
and, probably go explore the German castles, right?
I plan to, and the Scottish ones, if there's any left, which there aren't. So, but I'm joking there. I like the Scots. Just get your shit in order. Get those castles in order. We need them back. But yeah, so that's sometimes the high point of my week when you have a stressful. Well, school teachers, like 30 hours plus is the official like time they slot. They say you'll be working, but it's more. So like when I'm at work and I'm like, oh, I want to, castles. So it's like that dopamine hit, seeing those things. And I go, okay, I'm noting that down for what I'm going to see later. So thank you, Michael. You're a godsend when you post those.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the kind words. I appreciate it.
Anytime. All right. So, excuse me. I apologize to all listeners about that cough. I'll try to fix it in post. But the thing is, now we're going to take you all back to the time of that Ivanhoe is set in by Walter Scott. For now, those who follow Brothers Crin will probably know I'm a diehard Ivanhoe fanboy, fanatic, really. I have a religious fanaticism towards that book. One of my all-time favorites since I was 9 years old. Anyways, but the setting of Ivanhoe and Robin Hood, the Robin Hood stories also revolve around the same kind of ideas. Prince John as being an HR nightmare. But that guy was always an HR nightmare.
Yeah, he's also lame.
Well, he's interesting. Like he did expand the English bureaucracy and build up the English Navy quite a bit. So like I'll say dude was a tyrant and a disaster. But the thing about the Plantagenet is, now I hope Michael doesn't mind me kind of saying this about all the Plantagenet, they were all nightmares. But we have to say a big but here. But these guys were, each of them, talented men. Like, except for maybe Edward II and kind of Richard II. But even, now I don't really like Henry III. But I actually think a lot of his like architectural ideas and his investments in building up England into, like building up the aesthetic of England, like trying to make it aesthetically a rival on par with France and Germany is integral to the development of English history. So the thing with the Plantagenet is you have to take a very, I'm going to say balanced point of view. Now, I'm French, so I can't really like Henry V, but Henry V did do a lot of military reforms. Like, come on, like his conquests. Dude was conquering everything he looked at and whatnot. So that's at least my perspective. That, I wanted to be balanced here, and Henry V was a freaking good king for England. Freaking good king. But I'm downplaying it when I say that. Richard I, how do I put it? There had not been an English king who had this kind of his kind of military success since Henry I. And I'm only marking Henry I as successful is because he took England and conquered Normandy. Because we have to look at his takeover of Normandy as a conquest. Because there's, like, he conquered it from his older brother. And Robert was entrenched in Normandy. Like, there was no other heir. Because, the Norman lords felt him to be their commander, and Henry invaded. But when it comes to military brilliance and competence, I would argue Henri II, or Henry II, was more competent than Henry I. But Richard outshines his father. Like, there was a dazzling quality to him. Now, Richard Richard was raised in Aquitaine, where my ancestors stem from, or Poitou, as it's also known. The Poitou-Aquitaine region in this time period, during the 12th century, was the same region. It was one large territorial block. And Richard was basically raised there, from what I understand, for a good chunk of life, and was trained to take over that region. And it was the hardest region to master, really. The only one almost as tough was Tang, which I don't actually know how to say in English. I'm sorry. I've never been taught. So I don't know if you can know how to pronounce it, Michael, but it's the westernmost peninsular region in France, Bretagne. And it's right. And the thing is, Aquitaine, though, was the rebellious hotspot. Henri never fully mastered it. He imposed his laws upon it. He imposed his, I'll say, rule. But it was a tenuous rule. He couldn't really ride through the region like, you know what I mean, for funsies. He had to go in under arms and make sure, like, he projected power and majesty, which he could, but he preferred to dress like a peasant. Because Henri though, now Richard was raised in this hotspot region. Well, I shouldn't say raised, trained in this hotspot region. And in a lot of ways, Richard took more to his mother than his father, because his mother was much more involved in Aquitaine, because that was her inheritance. Henry II, as was pointed out by Dan Jones in his excellent documentary of, what was it, The Bloodiest Dynasty or something? I forget. Or The Bloody Dynasty. And in his book, The Plantagenet, and this is also something that W.L. Warren, the one I consider the finest biographer of Henri II, all biographers of Henri II and of that period, all back up the fact that Henri II was a freaking control freak. Like, he wanted Aquitaine to abide by his laws. He wanted to streamline all the laws, wanted everything, to run smooth and whatnot. He was a genius. But you can't really manage your family like you manage, I don't know, your vassals. So, and I think W.L. Warren pointed out, John and Henry II had the exact same personality in some ways, and the same instinct to, if you don't listen to me, I will crush you. You will do what I damn well tell you. But the reason Henri II has that side to him is also the influence of his mother, Mathilde, the empress who had to fight an entire 15-year civil war to try to get the crown. She never fully got it. But then Henri II comes in, manages to claim the crown at, what was it? I forget how old he was, but he was like, 20 or something? He was really young. And he claimed it after the most turbulent period in English history, possibly ever, in centuries. So I think not since the Viking invasion was England during Aelfred's reign in the 9th century was England in this big trouble. So we have here Henry, who's coming off these civil wars and thinking, I got to stamp down any kind of rebellion. But he's trying to micromanage his sons, and he doesn't really trust them. And he looks at them kind of askance when they fuck up. And he thinks they're always fucking up. The only one he likes is John. And John, as a military commander, is kind of lazy. He can be brilliant, like his dash from Normandy for Aquitaine. Stunning. He almost had that Richardian brilliance. Almost, not quite. But John could be brilliant, but lazy and venal. And John didn't love anyone except his half brother Guillaume, William. He had no love in his heart for anyone else in his life. And Henry II, now John, on the other hand, I will actually say, I think was a better legal mind than Richard. He knew how to like steal money from people through the law. He knew the law better than any other Plantagenet possibly ever. But that's not how you run a country. And Henry II kind of applied that kind of logic everywhere you went. And Richard was a dazzling knight. I may not like how he acted in Sicily, but if you study the third, I think it was the third crusade, right, Michael? Okay. Like, I'm always blown away by his campaigns and his stunning, like he did what chroniclers at the time complained Henry II could do. He could just teleport. That's what they believed. He could just teleport from one region to another. Richard could do it better in some ways. And there's a reason, I think it's Philip who said in a letter once when Richard was released after a brief captivity, the lion is loose. And that's really very apt for Richard I. And because Richard was a lion, John was as well, but John was a lazy lion, more like Scar, and from Disney. Sorry. And I've also been going on a Jeremy Irons blender, watching his movies. So you'll excuse me if I reference him. Actually, why in heaven's name was he never cast as Henry II in a drama? Or as King John, like an older King John? Seriously, Hollywood has disappointed us and failed us forever for that failed casting decision. Anyways, any thoughts, Richard? What would you say, what is your opinion about the breakdown in the relationship between Henry and Richard? Because eventually Richard just rebels openly against Daddy and says, fuck it, and whatnot.
Well, I think his rebellion is reasonable, and I should say, I think criticisms of Richard, for me, fall into two buckets. One is sort of legitimate criticisms, because there are legitimate criticisms of him. The other are just illegitimate criticisms. There's people who just simply hate the great man, and just nothing you say is going to make them like him. It's just, he murdered the prisoners at Acre. Whatever. And anything he did is wrong. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, well, I'm going to defend the actions at Acre. We have to understand, he couldn't really feed all these people. And the thing with the excuse me, Muslims is they were escalating at the time. He couldn't just okay. No, it's a war, for heaven's sake. It's an all-out war.
Right. And so where I'm going with this, though, is that there's a certain type of people who have certain types of criticisms that are essentially you're unable to even reason with. But as for legitimate criticisms, I think a good way to look at it is you could look at it as what is the alternative action? Because it's one thing to say well, he shouldn't have done this, or he shouldn't have rebelled against his father, or he shouldn't have, whatever these other things are. But what is a reasonable alternative? And so I think his rebellion against his father is reasonable. You can argue that maybe he wasn't the most dutiful son or something like this, but as you say, he was basically raised in Aquitaine. He was, I think, Duke since he was 16, if I recall correctly. And you are also correct that it was a fairly rebellious area. There was a couple really big families. The Lusignans were one. And I forget the Counts of Limoges or
Limoges.
Yeah. There was a handful of these other powerful families, and they all sort of ran things there in their own way. The Duke is sort of a nominal head, but they sort of did what they wanted. And Richard in particular, I mean, as you say, Henry sort of started the process, but Richard really brought these guys to heel. He organized everything. And of course, you can argue that perhaps he was too cruel, he was too aggressive, and they rebelled that one time because he was busy stealing everybody's ladies and passing them around to his soldiers after he was finished with them. So, he was a rough guy, but he brought the area under control, and he
And
really made it his own. Go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was also going to add to your statement. We need to also look at like Aquitaine. There's a before and after. Now, in his maternal grandfather's time, it was Guillaume the ninth or the 11th, something like that, had it under heel. But these guys have had like 50 to 60 years to just party. But at the same time, after Richard, the region never really rebels. We got to bear in mind, they had King John as head, and this region did not rebel against him like the other regions did. So Richard cemented Aquitaine as Plantagenet territory, and it remains so. It remains so until the Hundred Years' War. A lot of people don't realize how big a deal that is. Now, I'll actually criticize Richard. Just he overstretched and maybe overtaxed for his crusade effort Anjou, Normandy, and England. Now, I'm just saying, now he achieved a lot in the Crusades. But I think, because I was looking him up earlier, looking and balancing it all out, I think the greatest success has to be Aquitaine. He turned the ultimate battlefield into the most loyal region. That's something.
Yeah, that's certainly something that I think often goes overlooked. And I mean, I think he left England. He was born in England, but he left when he was about 8 years old. So he was in probably Aquitaine or some combination of Aquitaine and the rest of France, until he became Duke around 16. And then he spent, I believe, the next 9 years doing that. And he was taking castles, he was raising these castles, he was fighting these various rebellions. And it was really his efforts there that you say that made that a solid Plantagenet territory in perpetuity. I think that he would have. That's actually one of the things that I think is really stunning about his captivity is that even in captivity, he didn't really lose other than territory that was directly taken from him, either by John trying to do some shady stuff or through Philip Augustus. But he didn't really have any rebellions while he was in prison. That tells you something as well, especially considering, the amount of territory that John lost very quickly upon his ascension to the throne. So I think Richard, he's in a tough spot with his father once Henry the Young King dies. And, I think that his rebellion is reasonable. And Henry, his problem was that he didn't really adapt. He should have sort of recognized what was going on with Henry the Young King, how he was sort of becoming unsettled, he was becoming unhappy, and made some adjustments with that. He didn't, Henry Young King dies, but then when he tries to do basically the same thing with Richard, and Richard is just not having it. And I think one of the things that is also tough to consider from this time is that the succession is not as straightforward as we see it in hindsight. Of course, in hindsight, it's like, okay, well, Henry dies, Richard becomes king, but that's not guaranteed at the time.
There's no primogeniture at the time.
And there's no essentially direct, Richard illustrates this. Arthur of Brittany was his named successor at one point, and then apparently John was at a later point and on his deathbed. So, and they were both alive at both of those times. So the succession is somewhat fluid.
I'll also add to that and just say only the Capetiens were primogeniture at this point. Everybody else, it's a toss-up. Like Henry II technically usurped his younger brother's claim to Anjou because it was supposed to go to a younger brother. He just said no and kept it. So, and that was his favorite region along with England. So Richard, though, is not having it. Henry, I have no idea what he was thinking when he was like, "Oh, well, guess what? You're gonna have to give up everything you have and go become a puppet heir or something." I have no other idea. I have no idea what to call it, what the appropriate term is, because it's just he doesn't want his heir participating in the administration. You know what I mean? Like, okay, I'll actually defend him on young Henry the Younger King. Henry the Younger was a moron and would have been a disaster, and was a disaster. Geoffroy and Lichal, like the two next brothers, were competent men. They had tamed the two wild regions of Bretagne and Aquitaine. These were the biggest hot spots in medieval France's history. These were the, oh, you're going there for a field trip. Oh, you're dead. Or your wife's going to be violated. Have fun. Nobody wanted to go there. But the thing is, Geoffroy and Lichal left a firm impact so that the two regions were tamed afterwards. You would never again see Bretagne, for example, run crazy after Geoffroy, like on that level that it did before. Same with Aquitaine. So Henry, now in hindsight, like, okay, he didn't believe his sons could do as good a job. Maybe that's true, but they could still do a good job. You know what I mean? And yeah.
I think Richard had proved that he was pretty competent. And I think Henry kind of recognized that Richard had been a competent marshal, if you will, in Aquitaine. He had been a competent duke.
Yeah.
And, he had brought the area under control. He had, with reasonably little assistance from Henry, pacified the region. So I think that I think the problem was that Henry was just, he was just stubborn. Maybe he just thought it would work. It's kind of hard to understand exactly what he's thinking, but medieval kingship in a way is, especially in the earlier periods, it of course becomes more centralized the later that you go. But in earlier periods, it's definitely more ran by a consensus. And in these cases where you put your sons in these positions of being the Duke of Brittany or the Duke of Aquitaine, and your sons tell you no, I mean, that's the same as any other Duke telling you no. And so then you have to come to a way of finding some consensus. And if somebody's willing to go to the mat, and, then you got to figure something out. Henry had the conference where he met with Richard, and I believe Richard just ran away in the middle of the night and sent him a letter that said, "I'd rather die than not be Duke of Aquitaine." I mean, what else can you, you got to figure something else out here.
The other thing is that Henry II basically treated he's talking to the Duke of Aquitaine or the Duke of Bretagne, like he's talking to his two sons, and they're his marshals, as you call them. But he's treating them like they're 5-year-olds. And he's like, no, you have to give to John, or you have to do this, or I can take it away if I want. This isn't a toy, and these aren't children. These are freaking dangerous warriors who are, as now in Geoffroy's case, probably as brilliant as you, in Richard's case, more brilliant than you, as a military general. Like, stop treating them like 5-year-olds, because he probably was still thinking they're little kids. They're boys. Well, he was French, so sont des garçons. They're basically the little lads. I'll just, chuck a few coins at, and I'll tell them, now see here, I'm, daddy's speaking. They can't negotiate with him. Like, I'm a Henry II fanboy, and I'm like, there was no negotiating with him. He wasn't listening. And then you have Philippe Auguste, who's basically, I love Philippe Auguste, but he's basically whispering in their ears and saying, well, he's not going to listen. And they, everyone could see it. Even I didn't know. Like the man's freaking wife is like, he's not going to listen. He's patronizing us. We don't have a choice.
Well, and I think the issue is also, it's a crazy time with obviously this conflict between the Plantagenets and the Capetians, but also with the Plantagenets amongst themselves. You mentioned Henry I. He conquered Normandy from Robert Curthose. Robert Curthose died in jail. He spent the last 25 years. This is a crusading hero. He spent the last 25 years of his life in jail and died in jail. So, and Richard had already fought multiple rebellions from his brother Geoffrey and Henry the Young King. So his future was not secure. If he comes out of Aquitaine, there's no guarantee that he doesn't spend the rest of his life in prison. If he, his brother sees him or something like this, somebody changes their mind. I don't think security guarantees from his father necessarily mean that much in a way.
Well, I'll say this. I don't think Henry II would kill his son. I don't think he had it in him.
No, I don't think he would do that. I'm talking about after
Henry dies.
Right, after Henry dies. If Richard comes out of Aquitaine, let's say in a hypothetical situation, Richard gives Aquitaine to John, and he assumes the floating presumptive heir role that Henry the Young King had. Once Henry dies, if somebody ambushes him, takes him prisoner, somebody quickly gets to England and crowns himself first, and now there's some sort of civil war. Now he doesn't have Aquitaine. Now there's a civil war. He doesn't have any territory. His future's in jeopardy. What's he supposed to do in that type of situation? He doesn't have any base of power because somebody else is running Aquitaine. Maybe you could say he maybe has Normandy. It's like a total chaotic scenario.
Well, Normandy is also very vulnerable to conquest and is surrounded by the Capetiens in the east and north. You've got Geoffroy in the west. You'd have John in the southwest. And I will actually defend John and say he was not an imbecilic military commander. People forget that when Richard was ruling in the 1190s, one of his top commanders was John. So, John could be competent. He just needed someone to kick him in the ass and tell him, go work on something other than the law, because he was obsessed with law. Go do that military thing because you're not, Now, on the other hand, John totally mismanaged some of the military campaigns when he was king. But that's neither here nor there. He was a better second command than he was commander. But Richard would have nothing and be surrounded by enemies. And even if he could claim Normandy in England, England is not entirely secure. And Normandy has certainly never been secure because everybody and their mother has conquered it between the time of Robert Curthose and, heck, Henry II conquered it from under Stephen. So everybody and their mother has conquered it. Quite literally, considering Matilda. Technically, it was in her name that Henry II conquered it, as well as his own name. So technically, everybody and their mother did indeed conquer Normandy. Normandy had badass knights and warriors, who were some of the best warriors of medieval Europe. But everybody and their mother did indeed conquer. But what's interesting as well is that from out of this Plantagenet drama, I'm trying to be tactful. There's been a lot of literature that spun out of it. For example, excuse me, I'm so sorry about this. I actually did not have a cough until I got home. I don't know why. I'm gonna have to maybe clean my bedroom again. Sorry, I wash and clean my floors and everything pretty often. I'm a clean freak, a little OCD, but maybe that's the problem. Anyways, the thing is, Ivanhoe and Robin Hood. Now, Robin Hood was not originally attached to the Richard myth. Now, I call it the Richard myth. I don't. I'm just saying there's a difference between the literary Richard and the historic Richard. The historic Richard, like you pointed out, Michael, is a very tough guy. You teed him up. He had the Angevin temper. He had the Plantagenet temper. We see it on display a few times in a few historic episodes. He could rage out. He could spur a guy. Now, I know there were problems with the 2010 Robin Hood movie, but I have to admit, I really like the scene where he's like, there's the Englishman, and he's like, you told me what a king should never wants to hear, so I'm going to punish you, even though I asked you to tell me the truth. No, I'm not saying that's no. I don't think, given the Aqua thing and the way that Ridley Scott, had an anti Third Crusade attitude, but I don't fully agree with him. But Richard could be a tough guy, like you pointed out. He's not someone you cross lightly. Same with Henri II. Same with any Plantagenet. Even, oddly enough, Henry III. He invented hanging, drawing, quartering, which is one of the most horrifying tortures you can inflict on someone. So, you don't screw around with a Plantagenet lightly, unless you're a Capetier. I only mentioned that because the Capetier, I think it was it Dan Jones or was it someone else? I forget who. But someone once said that the Plantagenet were like fire and the Capetier were like ice. And that the Capetier could be capable of the same level of cruelty, but they're icy in their tempers. Like they'd hold a grudge for 20 years. And they'd hold on and serve revenge as a dish best served cold. And the best case for this was, to an extent, Philippe le Bel, Philippe IV, or Philip IV. He could be savage. But on the other hand, when the Capetians were not like that, they were like St. Louis, gentle and stable. I'll say that. But St. Louis was a very particular king. He was a wise king. He was the ideal medieval monarch. But Richard was a tough guy. But the Robin Hood myth, which was attached to one of the Richards, I forget which one. I read Robin Hood years ago. Like the original stories from the medieval period. I don't remember them. Apologies. But from there, Robin Hood got somehow grafted onto John and Richard. And then in the 19th century, we got Ivanhoe, which deepened the Lionheart legend. And now I hope you don't find the way I'm wording this or discussing the literary Richard as disrespectful. I'm not trying to criticize Richard on this one. I'm just saying how do I word it? The literary Richard is like a chivalric version of Goku. Like he's better than King Arthur. He's more chivalric.
He's the Super Saiyan King.
Yeah. He's the ultimate knight. Now, the historic Richard was brutal as hell when he put his mind to it. But I will acknowledge, unlike John, he could show honor. And John, I think he was allergic. Like, anytime he showed any kind of honor, other than to his half-brother Guillaume, and even then, he kind of screwed him at one point. Only at one point, which is quite something, because John never screwed. Well, John couldn't help himself but kick the other man when he was down. But William, he only screwed him over once, and William switched sides. But William and John had a very close-knit, tight bond. They were raised together, so they were basically twins, even though they had separate mothers, but they had the same father. So they were, I think, closer in age. And because they were raised since almost birth, there was a bond that was different. Because none of the Plantagenet brothers were raised together, for the most part, I think. Someone might be able to correct me in the comment section and say, or Michael might be able to correct me and say, no, you're wrong. I don't believe many of these Plantagenet sons were raised together. It was just the illegitimate William and John that were generally kept as a pair for some weird. I don't think that was entirely planned. It just kind of happened that way. But the thing is, Richard, the legend, has vastly outlived Richard, the historic figure. And we've gotten a wealth of chivalric literature that lives on to this day. And on top of that, I would argue that a lot of it has influenced fantasy fiction, because Robin Hood and Ivanhoe are direct products of the Lionheart moniker in a way, and legend and literature. And from there, we get this, um, well, this explosion of literature in the historic and fantasy sphere. Um, Now, I want to ask you, Michael, what is your opinion on the influence that not just Richard, but also the Normans and the Austrian Plantagenets in general have over like his, like historic fiction, fantasy, and whatnot, and like what your opinion is on this? I hope you don't mind. I'm genuinely curious because you're more history than fantasy, like I am.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's notable about Richard is that, especially for England, I think for England, he's really the first global celebrity, for lack of a better word. He was well known in his time around the world. And that is a very unique and unusual thing for a king of England in particular, but probably for kings of France or kings of almost anywhere else, and in such a short time. It's not like a situation like Charlemagne where he was known around the world after reigning for 30 years. Richard was world famous in the first 5 years of his reign, and he obviously
Mm.
died young and early in his reign. So it's almost kind of incredible to think, if he had lived another 10 or 20 years, how famous he actually would have been potentially. I
Oh
think
yeah, he would have been immensely popular and famous.
I think his influence. It's interesting because I'm somewhat familiar with the uh, mythological, I guess, if you will, Richard. In the Robin Hood and so forth. I think in a way it's interesting because when I read now more of the firsthand accounts of Richard, and to preface this by saying, of course, he's human and he has his faults and whatever. But I find that the Richard in the Chronicles delivers very much in the same way that you would expect from a mythological hero. So I don't find a lot of for
I
me,
get
I don't find a lot of difference in a way between sort of I mean, he's not invincible. He
Mm.
obviously he gets injured. He's not perfect. He has his faults. He makes mistakes and those sorts of things, but he really delivers in a very heroic way multiple times across many things. And I think somewhat unusually, he's also able to calibrate between these instances of being extremely brutal and then being extremely merciful, like with John is a perfect example. And sort of these paradoxical qualities of being very savage while being very merciful, or being very you might say cruel in some ways, but then also being very generous in other ways. Or as it's been described, being very reckless with his own life, but being very careful with the lives of his men.
Well,
He
I
had
think
he had a lot of paradoxical qualities about him. Go ahead.
he's this kind of leader. I would not give an order I would not be willing to do myself. And like, I have criticisms about his policies, like about like the taxation policies that ultimately did lead to the rebellions and the rage that the barons had with John. Yeah, I know John amped it up to like a 20, but the thing is, Richard had amped it up to 10, and John, well, 9-ish. I should actually correct myself. He amped because Aquitaine got off a little lighter than the other regions. John just amped it all up to 20 or 30 with frick scutage payments. And but I think that with Richard, what's fascinating is the personal courage. Now, I'm actually going to admit that when I read the historic record of Charlemagne, St. Louis, and oddly Louis the 13th, I find that I have similar sentiments, and I find that I actually hold up their personal character up in a way. Like, these men were, I know they had their flaws, but I find it hard to criticize them as people. Like, I actually tend to think they're better men than me, and I'm like, no, I don't like. for example, Charlemagne, people might say Verdun. But if you look at the people he executed, a lot of them raped nuns and murdered children and whatnot. So that's like 4,500 criminals, hardcore criminals. He simply said, okay, enough. I've been tolerating this for almost 30 years. Stop. And, he sent a message saying, fine, you think I'm a pussy for not, just outright killing all my prisoners? Done. And after that, that's when the nun raping and the child murdering and the innocent men killing stopped to an extent, because Charlemagne said, here's the line. It was his act. He was saying, stop. I've tolerated this for so many years. You don't do that. So, like, St. Louis was not, he earned his moniker of saint. As for Louis XIII, I know, he's portrayed as weak and spineless and even a bit of a clown by Alex Dumas. But when you read the historic record, he had a backbone. His mother was a treacherous woman. Richelieu was actually more his puppet than vice versa. Because, he once took his staff and his royal scepter and smashed on Richelieu's head in a rage. Richelieu basically broke down crying right there from the pain, and was like, stop, don't hurt me. Please, boss. I don't know what I did, but, stop, don't hurt me. Because, Louis XIII was an intense guy with a Plantagenet temper. So, but Louis XIII had a vision for France, and even bluntly stated, Richelieu, you only have the job because you can actually put my vision into effect, but you're still my bitch. You're my bitch, and you're done. And we'll be done. Like in Breaking Bad, we are done when I say we're done. Like that scene. So that's basically Louis XIII. But Louis XIII did have a good side, because he spoon-fed Richelieu when Richelieu was sick. He was like, I love you as a friend. I don't want you to die. Let me spoon-feed you. Let me nurse you. I'm sorry I ever hit you in the past. I'm sorry I treated you badly. Let me help you. So, that's the thing. When I was younger, I'd criticize Richard much more hardcore, but when you read the historic record and you live, I guess, a bit longer into your 30s, you start to realize, or 50s or whatever, how old Black Knight is, you start to understand their perspective. And that's the thing, with history, you got to read it with perspective in mind. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on a spiel.
You're good. One of the other things that I would add to that is, with Richard's global celebrity, is we have the benefit of seeing his character across a variety of other chroniclers, whether it's the Muslim chroniclers or the German chroniclers, and these other guys who, for all intents and purposes, should be very hostile to him, Muslims in particular. But I think we find that the Muslim chroniclers are actually pretty, in the same way that I wouldn't say, we sort of make this mistake a lot with Saladin, the royal now, where people will say, well, Saladin, he was whatever, particularly honorable. To whatever degree that's true, they still wanted to fight him to the death. And so the same thing with the Muslims. To whatever degree that they have something nice to say about Richard, they still wanted to kill him. But they had a lot of relatively nice things and admirable things to say about him, where they thought he was an admirable enemy. They thought he was very chivalric. They thought his personal prowess and bravery was exceptional. They thought he was a unique disaster, essentially, that was let loose upon the Muslims. And they thought he was extremely very capable at diplomacy, and even very well cultured, as there's apparently that story of him listening to the music with I believe it's Aladdin, Saladin's brother, and he brought in the Muslim musicians, and Richard was saying, yeah, this is good, keep it up, let's hear some more, let's hear some more of the Muslim music. And they all thought that was really incredible. So, and the same thing with the his experience essentially in captivity in Germany, where they had this show trial that was supposed to be, it's supposed to be an open shut case. We're going to have the trial, and just to sort of check the essentially appropriate administrative boxes. And Richard spoke so eloquently at the show trial, and defended himself so well that he basically won over most of the court to his side, to the point where Henry the Sixth, I believe it was Henry the Fourth, Henry the Sixth,
Henry the Sixth, I think it was. Yeah.
and he basically had to say, yeah, okay, that may be true. You're still our prisoner, though. Like, he had to basically like retract the whole thing because Richard was so persuasive and eloquent and had won over most of the court to his side.
Before Richard charmed Heinrich, because he later charmed him, and Heinrich let him go.
Well, and then he took Richard along. Apparently, he took him around to make some of these diplomatic deals with him as well.
But what's also funny is that this entire let's have a trial, we'll do it all the prim and proper way. Sorry if I'm like, Germans. You have to do it all fair and square. It's got to be a just trial. Come on. Philippe Auguste, I'm going to have a trial in absentia. You're not allowed to show up for your own trial or defend yourself. Guilty. Done. That's how you do it. He did that to not just Richard, Henry II, and also John. Philippe Auguste had it. He knew you don't let, like, when you're like, oh yeah, I want to take all your lands. You don't let the guy defend himself. Now, I'm actually going to defend John and say, John knew if he even showed up for court, Philippe would, like, John would, like, you know what I mean? He'd be imprisoned. Like, I like Philippe. I'm a Philippe fanboy, as you well know from Twitter and Substack. I'm a fan.
I know, it's horribly unfortunate.
But I'm like, a fair trial? Yeah, right. But I'm proud of Philippe Auguste for that, because he's smart. He knows you don't give a fair trial to any of these guys, because all three of them are pretty eloquent in their own way.
Yeah, and I guess the only point I wanted to make with that, though, is that because of Richard's global reputation and his mention across all of these chronicles and across all of these chronicles that should be hostile to him, I think we really get a picture of somebody who was quite exceptional in reality, I guess is really the point that I wanted to make with that.
Now, I guess my next question is, do you think a lot of the... Now, I know Aragorn is more inspired by King Arthur, so I'm going to leave him out of it, because I know where the inspiration for him comes from, and it's... I don't think much of it is from Richard. I'm not trying to insult Richard. I'm just saying Aragorn with Tolkien is he was combining an Anglo-Saxon king, I think from like the 7th century, with King Arthur, the King Arthur myth, with a bit of, I would venture to say, like, several different kings. There may be a small bit of Richard in the pot, like in the stew, but there's so many different sources. But do you think many fantasy writers and whatnot, writers who write lion-hearted kings, whatnot, do you think they're influenced to an extent by Richard? I'm also turning the question to Black Knight as well as you, Michael. So, like, you can both give your perspective on this one. While I'm also gonna just quickly make myself a hot chocolate.
Sure. Well, I'm less familiar, so I'll just toss it to Black Knight and let him field that one.
Well, I do think quite a lot of contemporary modern fantasy authors are probably basing their king archetypes on fantasy Richard. They are drawing inspiration from the Robin Hood stories and all of the things that have been grafted together, as you mentioned earlier, and they are not quite basing their king archetypes on the real historical kings, because there were other kings they could draw inspiration from, except Richard. But as you so far discussed it, he has been in the spotlight. He had the limelight, even while he was still alive, before he got shot, but by that. If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm not mistaken, he got shot
Cook.
by that kid.
Oh, it was the cook.
And if I remember correctly, before he died, he called the kid.
It was not a kid. It was a cook.
Yeah, he was a cook, and he said, "I forgive you,"
Which is something.
which is
We have to take note of something, because like you're a foodie and an excellent chef, Black Knight. So I guess the moral of the story is don't with the cook.
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah, probably he got like his sauce or his soup got ruined because of the siege one too many time, and he just grabbed the crossbow and decided to
No one
vent.
messes with my cooking time.
Yes. No one screws my meals. So perhaps in the Eastern storytelling, there were not so many kings based on Richard, but more on
Western Europe.
famed Hungarian and Polish and also Eastern Roman rulers, and of course more than a few based on our kings, and Khans as they were known, which is somewhat erroneous, but I'm not going to go into detail. And some of the, I mean, I've noticed some of the younger authors over here. I've met with some of them and had a chat last year at an event, a private event, and coincidentally, some of them had a few of our most famed kings. For example, Boris the First, the Baptizer, who quote unquote baptized Bulgaria, though it was, but I mean that's the official story of it. But they took him as an inspiration because of his vicious, absolutely vicious treatment of the rebellious barons. In our case, they are not called barons; they're called boyars. So he became a monk. He abdicated for his son, who after the baptizement, he reverted back to the pagan faith, and his father came back from the monastery and basically exterminated, was it 2/3? Yeah, 2/3 of the barons. He killed almost all of the barons and their families and their children. It's like he said that they should die like to the ninth relation. So the young authors I spoke with, like some of them had many of their kings inspired by him, partially inspired by him, and also Simeon the Great, who was his successor and one of the greatest kings ever. You could say that he's if we compare him and Richard, perhaps he is just as brave and a great tactician and strategist and a warrior and a knight, but he was also master of the arts, literature. He built a whole lot of churches, of course, and he made sure that we had a lot of libraries over here built, and one of the most, as you know, in the Middle Ages, one of the most expensive pleasures was to copy books. Books, they were expensive. You didn't have cheap printing, as you know. So yes, in that how should I put it? In our side, in the eastern side here, we do have perhaps not enough kings inspired straight by Richard. The myths about Richard and Robin Hood, all of that, but more like our versions of him. And of course, we do have some characters who, as the my friends told me, were inspired by Eastern Roman emperors. And I think one of the guys told me that he had a villainous king was inspired by Basil the Bulgar Slayer.
Who I like to call Basil the Awesome.
Yeah,
I really like him.
super awesome. Yeah.
Basil for the win.
Today is the anniversary of his death, by the way, I believe. Isn't that right?
I forgot about that. Cool. So I guess in Eastern Europe, it'd be the king you mentioned who's the inspiration. While in Western Europe, well, maybe not in Spain, but like I guess in France and the British Isles, I'm going to say the Anglo-Celtic zone and Germany. I have to throw in the Germans. Damn it. I'm joking. I like the Germans. I just like to pick on them a little. Black Knight can vouch for that. Maybe Richard, and even Scandinavia, actually, because there's quite a few novels and TV shows about Richard that hold him up in Scandinavia. Arn the Knight or something, I forget what it's called.
Yeah.
Richard, and this is also, I think, been established in North America and the rest of the Anglosphere. Richard is almost the Arthurian knight king in a lot of ways. And having looked into things a little and thought about it, and I'm not sure if I'll ever write this as an essay, but I've considered it. Richard as one of the possible inspirations to a limited extent for the interpretation of Mufasa, because I just see a bit of the Lionheart element. I know Mufasa is like, he's more a dad in the story, but because he's played by James Earl Jones. James Earl Jones can only play father figures or evil villains who think they're a father figure. That's all he can do. I'm joking. I'm a James Jones fanboy, but I have to crack this joke. But Richard is someone I think who had a lot of influence also in that direction of things on a cultural level. And that when you look at the good king, bad king, like, you know what I mean? Like the one brother is a good king and the one brother is a bad king, like Richard and John and whatnot. I think there's a bit of this, at least in I'm going to say Western Europe again, and I'm using the term very lightly here. Like I know that it's more than just Western; there's also Northern, and there's also the Anglosphere. But I'm going to say like I'll say the chivalric sphere, and just bear with me. I know it's not that clear cut, but the thing is, and even Italy, I guess I've seen a bit of this in their stories. The one brother is a good king, the one brother is a bad king. I kind of think to an extent has its roots in the Richard John dynamic. And John's also the evil uncle, I think, in literature, or helped inspire to an extent. I know the archetype like predates him, but he kind of redefined it, or at least those who made him into a character in Robin Hood and whatnot redefined him into that role. But I don't know what you think, Michael, of this perspective on a literary front about Richard and John kind of seeping into the I don't want to say popular imagination, but like the over the course of the centuries, the cultural imagination people have about juxtaposing two different kings together like this.
It's an interesting thought. I think you kind of nailed it with the Lion King. I hadn't really thought of it that way before, but Mufasa and Scar, I feel like has a pretty decent through line. That's a tough one to think about. You know, it's such a generalization, maybe, to think about how people think about kings today with these juxtapositions. That's one of the things that I've been trying to do a little bit more with my project, is to sort of make these more obscure analyses, because it's like an interesting way to compare and contrast them.
I don't think it's a conscious thing. I think I view it, I guess, more as a like how do I put it? You know, like the Campbell has his universal unconscious. I kind of view it as like, you know, it's like baked into our cultural, you know what I mean, heritage. I don't know if that's the right word, but like it's kind of like it's not in the front of the brain. It's like somewhere in the back of the brain. You know what I mean?
Well, what's really strange about Richard, the way he's perceived, I mean, because I do a lot of Richard posting on X, and one of the things that's really strange is how his reputation suffers from normies for a lot of things that are completely ridiculous. Like these people who say stuff like he never spoke English, he hardly spent any time in England.
No.
Those types of things are just total nonsense, as far as like what would make him a bad king or those types of things. I mean, they're not untrue. He didn't spend hardly any time in England as a king, and he may or may not have spoke English. We don't really know. But what's also interesting about that is that I actually have a podcast coming up. I think I'm gonna release it on the 3rd of January with John Gillingham, who is the world's foremost scholar on Richard the Lionheart. And one of the things that was really interesting about talking to him about this, because I kind of wanted him to address some of these criticisms of Richard. And he was like, wait a minute. Are you telling me people are still saying this stuff? You know, like his big thing was like, you're kind of shocking me here. Like I thought when I wrote the book, like this would like put an end to all of it. But there still persists a lot of these different ideas about Richard that, you know, are frankly just very silly. I think he's, you know, like you mentioned, the quote unquote massacre at Acre. I feel like modern scholarship has, you know, I don't want to say exonerated, because he obviously did kill them, but it wasn't sort of an unjustified or unreasonable. It wasn't just like an act of just, you know, insane barbarity or something, you know, like a moment of insanity.
Wanton slaughter. Yeah.
Right. And I think modern scholarship has basically said, you know, we don't have to like it, but that's just how it goes. And that's pretty common for the contemporary times as well. If you take a city in a siege, that's what the sack part is your guys going through and having their way with stuff, whether that's killing people, whether that's worse, whatever is the, you know, that's how sieging a city works.
And also going to compare, like, now I'm not a fanboy of Henry V, for example, or the Black Prince. There's a difference between how they handled a sack or like being in a territory. Like Black Prince, oh, it's a chevauché, so I'm gonna basically like completely destroy people and whatnot. And Richard, who said, boys, some limits. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we're gonna do this, but I'm gonna organize it. You're not just clear cutting. You're not just like, you know what I mean? You can have fun.
Right.
But, you know, he was like, you know what I mean? He wouldn't just, I just view him differently. And
Well,
like,
Richard adhered to what you would think of as the chivalric norms of the day, in that higher end emirs or prisoners were ransomable. He knew that Saladin had some of his guys and he wanted to swap hostages. So, you know, the point that I'm trying to make with this is that there's lots of these sort of silly, essentially silly nonsense critiques of Richard that still are very, very like ingrained in the public consciousness. Whenever I post about Richard, I get a handful of these comments every time from all kinds of different people. And these things somehow persist, even though there's really no basis for it, for them being legitimate. So I sort of have a hard time, you know, maybe with fantasy writers or fiction writers, it's a little bit different because they, you know, those are people who are maybe more into the history per se, and are writing more in terms of sort of heroes and villains. But I think for the general public consciousness, I feel like there still is a very warped perception of Richard's memory in our time. And
I think I know one of the reasons, one culprit.
Ridley Scott.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
No, I'm actually kind of serious. I think his movie with Richard left, as well as The Kingdom of Heaven, I think these kind of movies left a, you know what I mean? Some sort of impact in a way on Richard's reputation, but also generally Western Europe's reputation at large.
Yeah, I think the public or popular media in the last several decades has been massively influential. Another one would be, what's his face, Dan Carlin, his series on the Mongols. There is a whole category of people out there, a non-insignificant amount of people, who think the Mongols were these invincible super soldiers because they listened to Dan Carlin's Wrath of the Khan or whatever it is.
They were not. I can tell you a little bit about what happened. I think I mentioned it a few of the posts back like last year, was it? When someone mentioned on your post, Michael, on Substack, something about the Mongols, and I just made a joke about them coming to like ravaging Hungary and then getting their asses handed, and then coming here and getting their asses handed, but primarily by peasants, because the border, mostly the border villages here were, it was land that the kings were giving to soldiers, elite soldiers. They were giving their land to them, and when I say peasants, I'm like doing the air quotation. They were not stupid. So when they came here, they did stuff here and there, but the trouble was that they expected everything to be really, really easy. And so they made a few mistakes, more than a few mistakes, and they just got obliterated. And the peasants just hunted them down. They killed them, and they took their horses. They were killing them because they needed the horses for farming, the Mongol horses for farming, pretty much. And we have a whole lot of even archaeological evidence, even though that's like, considering the fact that most of the artifacts. Most of the artifacts made from wood and leather, which was at the time the horse gear that they were using. They would not survive, but the bones of the horses have survived. Yeah, and people have made like analysis, DNA analysis, and they have discovered that these are the same horses, the same kind of horses that the Mongols have used. So that's one of the things that I would say in support of Michael when he mentions that they weren't these like super in all conquering warriors that invincible.
Well,
Yeah, 'cause
yeah, and the only point I was trying to make with that is just that popular media has skewed the way, and rightfully so, I suppose, because that's how it works, the way that people perceive these things.
All right. Not gonna lie, I'm really tired, so I'm gonna ask any closing remarks from you guys.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to speak with you, Black Knight, and you as well, Joe. So thanks for having me on, and
Hopefully we'll do this again.
fun. Yeah.
So I'm gonna also plug Michael and Black Knight. I'll be posting this on my Substack, and hopefully, with you guys' permission, cross-posting this because I
All right.
cross
Yeah.
the stocks. And I will insist, and I'll also be posting the link to Michael and Black Knight's Substacks in the comment section. And I would beg you guys, please subscribe to them. Their Substacks are quite remarkable. You have the best recipes from Bulgaria and some of the best science fiction, well, maybe even the best science fiction on Substack, and some of the best fantasy fiction on Substack, on Black Knight's Substack. And you have some of the best history podcasts, maybe even the best I've seen on Substack at all. And I think you're also on YouTube, aren't you? Okay.
Yeah, I cross-posted on YouTube.
Okay. But Michael has one of the best channels and one of the best Substacks. So please, people, subscribe to him. I'm subscribed, and I'm still catching up on the podcast, though. I'm sorry, I've fallen behind. Damn December, but I'll catch up. I've got like a week and a half off. I'm gonna take that time. I'm gonna listen to every single one I can, even if it involves Richard Glazing. I'm joking. I'm joking.
Well, the Richard Glazing won't start till 2026.
Oh, phew.
Yeah, so you're safe for now.
Oh,
But I will say the next episode is going to be a total banger. It'll release on Substack tomorrow, which I guess will probably be, you'll have this out before or after that, I suppose, but on the 16th and then on the 17th on YouTube and everywhere else. But I got in touch with a guy who's basically just a small town college professor who teaches a class and specializes in historical food and feasting. And so we had a conversation about medieval foods and medieval feasting and, sort of the cuisines that they had and the four humors and how they thought about how these, the air, wind, earth, water, air,
whatever.
Earth,
Metal?
water, air, fire, how they all interact with each other as it relates to food and it relates to your diet and the humors and how they feasted. And it was a real banger. It was a real incredible conversation. So I got that Christmas special coming out, so you'll enjoy that, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, I need to listen to that for my fantasy fiction. I'm gonna need to listen.
I should say that perhaps after discovering Michael's channel on Substack, before him I was enjoying this guy from Britain. He's riding horses. He's like the night historian, I think.
Modern History TV, I think is his name.
Yeah, I think it was. And we had like a few chats with him. We exchanged comments about food, traditional food, and how some of the modern contemporary Eastern European recipes from the Balkans, for example, they have their roots back into like a Roman, late Roman cooking, and the entire culture of the road, like the mass road network, and how it spread. All of the science of cooking, almost as you probably know better than I from that chat with that specialist. But yes, please subscribe to him. You will especially if you like medieval history, you will love his channel.
All right. So with that said, we'll see you guys later. Namaste, I guess. See you
Been a
around.
pleasure. Thank you, fellas.
Oh yes.
Thank you.